Continuity in architecture is, of course, interested in a similar thing. We're interested in the past, rewritten in the present, for a future. That applies to buildings, it applies to cities, and it applies to the details of those buildings and cities. It is, in broad terms, a contextual approach. Tonight's lecture is called Ruining the Ruins, a Manifesto for Failure. Michel Macarius, in his book Ruins, explores the question of the ruin from the perspective of art history. At one point, he says this: the ruin reflects an image of the viewer, as does a mirror. Between the recollection of what was and the hope for what will be, in the ruin, humanity contemplates the familiar image of time. It's double. And that really is the essence of working with existing buildings. We are at the same time, contemplating the past, even as we consider our future and ultimately our own mortality. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ed for tonight's lecture. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks very much, John, and thank you all for inviting me here. Can you all hear me, first of all?
Loud and clear, Ed.
Great, that sounds excellent. And what I'll now do is share the screen. That's the next excitement. And then what I shall do is slideshow. Okay. Great. So is everyone seeing the slides there? Great. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Excellent. So thanks very much. My talk tonight is entitled Ruining Ruins, a Manifesto for Failure. And what I want to think about is to reflect a little bit on some of the things that John was just mentioning in the ways that we imagine ruins. And in particular, two ideas about them, or three. Perhaps first, that they refer to the past. Secondly, that they refer to mortality. And thirdly, because they refer to the past and mortality, that there's something wrong with them and we should do something about them. And what I'd like to explore perhaps is, or question, is that assumption. Should we be fixing these things? What will go wrong? What could possibly go wrong if we did? I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, first of all. This is me when I was about 15, long before I ever actually started studying architecture. This is a painting called The Architect's Dream, painted in 1838, so around about the time of the foundation of the discipline or its professional associations. It's painted by a painter called Thomas Cole, and to me, certainly when I was 15 and young and naive, represented everything that I thought I was going to be when I became a proper grown-up and a proper architect, which is that I would lounge on a gorgeous Doric column, contemplating beautiful sculpture-like objects which I had designed. And somehow, like all of these ones, like the Parthenon, like Salisbury Cathedral or the Great Pyramid, they would all remain in their marbled perfection forever and ever, as new as they were the day that I conceived them. That was my dream. And like all dreams, it wasn't real, and I woke up. And instead, I found myself working for a small architect's practice in Edinburgh, Richard Murphy Architects, where we would daily get down on our knees and pray for somebody to ask us to do a toilet extension or a small alteration to put a back door in a building or whatever it might be. And I soon learnt that the bread and butter of a lot of architectural practice is nothing to do with the design of marbled monuments and a great deal to do with the alteration of existing buildings. This was the first building I worked on as a project architect, the first Maggie's Centre in Edinburgh, which involved the alteration of an old 19th century stable on the edge of an old 19th century hospital to get it to serve a very different purpose. I was very proud of it when in 1995 when it was finished, and 3 years later somebody else in the office came along and extended my extension, and then somebody extended that extension, and somebody's extended that extension, and so on. So my ruination of the original building has been ruined several times over already. I started teaching and working in academia in 1999 at Edinburgh Napier University, and then subsequently at Edinburgh College of Art and now Edinburgh University. And I've been working all that time in the field of interiors, at times interior architecture, at times interior design, and so on. It's been a very interesting time to be in that part of the spatial design world. It's a part of the world of that world which has been developing and changing a lot. And during that time, I've used my position within academia to kind of write about this practice of alteration, of ruining ruins. So these are a number of the books. The latest one on the right has been written with your very own Sally Stone, I'm delighted to say, inside information on your shelves soon. What all of these books have in common is that they're composed out of short stories, quite often beginning with Once Upon a Time, and quite often ending with Happily Ever After or not, but very much stories about buildings and what happens to them. And that's what I continue to be fascinated by, is to imagine a building not as an object, but as something which unfolds over time. Probably making buildings, or a building, is much more like a souffle or a flower arrangement than we ever might like to imagine. It's something that unfolds over time like a piece of music or a story itself. I'm currently working with a group of heritage enthusiasts in a coal mining town in West Bengal in India, a town called Asansol. And here are some of the buildings which we're working with or looking at. These buildings have been built over the last 150 years and are all related to the coal industry. So on the left we can see the 1920s mansion of a coal mining executive, and on the right the owner, the mine owner's house, now, as you can see, in a kind of crater. And I love these buildings because they seem to be like the most ghastly disasters. Something's gone horribly wrong. Something is a real mess here. And what I've been discussing with my friends in the Asansol Heritage Research Group really is what sort of problems do these buildings and the current condition of these buildings actually represent? What sort of problems are these? Or indeed, are they problems at all? Is there anything wrong with having buildings in this condition? Is there anything wrong with not trying to fix them, but just enjoying them as they are? Is there anything wrong with letting these sorts of buildings continue to be ruins, albeit, as we shall see, occupied ruins? I'm not going to talk about them in great detail now, because what I want to do is I'll return to them at the end, having considered one building I've spent about a decade working on and with, which is a little bit better known in the UK, and that's St. Peter's Seminary at Cardross, just outside Glasgow. Some of you might have heard of this building, some of you might not have heard of this building, and what I'll do is kind of tell you its story, with a particular view, really, perhaps, to returning to these things. Is a condition of a building in this condition, is that a problem at all? And if so, what sort of a problem is it, and might it be? So I'd like to start out, first of all, by telling you the story of St. Peter's Seminary in Cardross, and I'll do it as a once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a monk about 1600 years ago who wandered into the wilderness of Strathclyde and sat down by a river in a cave and built a cell. He was called Matthew, and so that site was called Kilmehew, the cell, the chapel of Matthew. And then somebody built a castle on that site, and then the family who built the castle lost all their money, and they sold it to a 19th century industrial magnate who built this very baronial mansion that you can see here in this image, sometime in the 1860s and 70s, the Byrne family. And then, after the Second World War, the Byrne family went the same way as the people who had built the castle before them, and they had to sell their property. And they sold it to the one organisation that never goes bust, the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church then took on this building, and this being after the Second World War, a time of great resurgence of Roman Catholicism in Scotland, they decided to turn this building into a seminary, that is a college for training priests. And they didn't go to some old-fashioned, very traditional architect, but employed the most avant-garde architects of their time in Glasgow, the practice Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, to build a new building next to the baronial mansion. And here are some images of that building. It was completed in the late 1960s, won all sorts of awards, was occupied for about 10 years, and now if you go there, it looks like this. So it looks like something rather different. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of this particular building. But actually, that's just the beginning of the story. Ask a great many people in Scotland, when did St. Peter's Seminary start getting interesting? It certainly wasn't when the original architects designed it. It was when people started doing things with it after it was abandoned. And what I'm going to explore in this lecture is what happened next. As we are giving this lecture right now, new plans are afoot for this building. I'd like, this is a kind of excerpt from the AJ, but I just thought this was kind of, I thought we already know what's going to happen here, because what's the first lines of the headline here? As yet another architect is brought in to try to resuscitate Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer's rotting brutalist gem, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't sound like a very optimistic story, as yet another architect is brought in to try to resuscitate. Doesn't sound like a recipe for success. Is this a recipe for failure? Is this a recipe for repeated failure? The church had to abandon the building. The family who built the house had to abandon the building. The family who built the castle before had to abandon the building. It is not a pretty story with a happy ending. What I'm going to do in this lecture is think about the biography of that building since that time of abandonment. What's happened and how did it happen? And what I want to make an argument for is an idea that the castles in the air that have been built in the imagination around these ruins are perhaps, in fact, its real legacy, much more so than the actual physical bricks and mortar which we might encounter on the site. So I've made a study of the building in the years since its opening. So unfortunately, I've made this read from right to left. It's a bit counterintuitive, but you'll see why in a second. So in 1966, when the seminary opened, is on the left, and 2018, the great before, is on the right. And what you can see here are a number of different stages, so that in the top line you can see quite simply that between 1966 and 1979, 1980, the building was used as a seminary, which is what it was designed to do. Then it was closed, then it was used as a rehab facility, drugs rehab facility for a couple of years, and then it was abandoned. But what I'm going to look at is the things below in particular. So the idea of what have the attempts been made to reuse and reconfigure this building? How did it get lost? How was it relinquished? How do people reflect on that? And then since 2008, since the crash, how have people tried to reoccupy it? So I'm going to focus first of all on the moment after this abandonment. Okay, so what happens quite simply is that the building does what all respectable buildings should do. It leaks. It's very cold, it's unheatable, it's inconvenient, and so on. But more importantly, perhaps, it never really had a function in the first place. If you open a seminary for trained Catholic priests in the same year as the Paris student riots and the White Album, then you're probably on a hiding to nothing. They were never able to drum up enough priests to want to come to this seminary. And so by the 1980s, the middle of the 1980s, there was already a move to find another use for this building. It was designed to house 200 priests. It ended up with 25. Imagine 25 people living in a building built for 200. And so it was used as a drug rehabilitation centre sponsored by the church for a while. And then that was seen not to work either. And what you can see on my timeline here is then that the Archdiocese, who owned the building, then set themselves to thinking about other purposes: conversion into flats, the restoration of the whole complex as a conference centre, the idea to convert the main block of the building into townhouses, and so on. These are kind of the sorts of projects that probably those of you in continuity in architecture are quite often thinking about. How do you reuse and reconfigure existing structures? But there were real problems with reusing and reconfiguring this sort of structure. What you can see on the right-hand side is an image of the building under construction, and you can see it's very cellular. It was built out of lots of small cells for the trainee priests to be in there. And these walls were all cast out of concrete in situ. And therefore, the idea of being able to knock one room into another or reconfigure the floor plan in any way was a bit of a non-starter, made impossible by the construction of the building. And on the left, you can see in the cross-section of the building those study bedrooms, those small study bedrooms, and then galleries, and then a kind of extraordinary space in the middle. We'll see a few images of it as it comes up, which was at one end of the building, the chapel, and on the other, the refectory. But it's a kind of, while that might be great for a collegiate building where lots of young men, this is a single-sex institution, live in small rooms and go to chapel and eat together. They ended up playing football in the refectory together. Here, it wouldn't make a brilliant model, for example, for private houses, for families. The rooms were too small to be hotel bedrooms, and so on. And so the Archdiocese's plans to think of new functions for the building never quite stacked up. And they could also never get planning permission for them. And there was this bizarre moment where the Archdiocese repeatedly, and you can see this from the timeline here, kept on applying for planning permission to convert the building into something else. And at the same time, in the expectation that they'd never get given that permission, they also made lots of planning applications to knock the building down. And because the building had received lots of awards, nobody actually gave them planning permission either to build something new in it or to knock it down. Now, the Catholic Church has been around for 2022 years, I think, since Christmas this year. And so they are a uniquely patient institution. They outlived the Roman Empire, they outlived the British Empire, they can outlive Strathclyde County Council and the politics of how they decide to give planning permission. And so they decided that they would lock the building up and wait and see what would happen. They decided to wait and see what would happen until a solution could be found. And that was now, given that was really after the end of the rehab in 1988, so that's kind of nearly kind of 25, 30 years. That might be a blinking of an eye in the timescale of an institution that's 2,000 years old, but is a very long time for a building, particularly a concrete one. So from time to time, these plans will be put forward to reuse it, but basically the building was left alone. And it became a kind of bit of a cause célèbre, particularly in the 1990s, and here's a variety of different players in it. So the first one is a priest who was trained in the building. I'm amazed that a building that's ever fulfilled the purpose for which it was built, because badly designed and constructed, should even be considered for an award. What people need from Historic Scotland, that's our heritage body here, is not an award, but a bulldozer. Gavin Stamp, the architectural critic, says Cardross was never given a chance the abandonment of so much built capital, let alone an astonishingly sophisticated and powerful reflection of the ideas which had inspired Glasgow's most celebrated modern firm, was really an avoidable tragedy. The problem is not the architecture of Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, but Scotland. But I think Gordon Benson, who's the architect of the National Museum of Scotland here in Edinburgh, made perhaps one of the most interesting observations. It's an observation that he shared with Izzy Metstein, who was one of the architects of the building. Cardross should be stripped of its dilapidated facing, so that its structure may stand overlooking the Clyde as an archaeological monument. So by the time of the middle of the 1990s, in the face of either being unable to find a new use for this building or of being able to get rid of it, people said, why don't we turn it into an archaeological monument? This is a building which dates all the way back to 1968. Let's make it an archaeological monument. There's a time at which people began to give up imagining futures for this building. And of course, at precisely the same moment, what we have, and this happens frequently on many sites as we know, is a group of people get together to attempt to save the building, led by Penny Lewis here. I think there's kind of a strange irony actually in the photographs here, where you can see them standing there in 2004. The building's now been completely abandoned for 10 years or more. They put a notice up going, let's kind of save the building, and within 6 months or so, of course, even the notice itself becomes a ruin, and their attempts are kind of thrown upon the wind. But at the same time, one of their members, Dan Dubovitz, a photographer and filmmaker, started to appreciate something different about this building, and in particular, in his monograph, Wastelands, photographic monograph, he included this building, now ruined with burnt out cars in the garden and so on, among a kind of whole series of ruined and abandoned buildings. It's taking its place in a different canon. So rather than in the canon of forward-looking, exciting modern architecture, it enters the canon of the ruin. And at this point, something really, really interesting begins to happen. And in particular, Dan Dubovitz's work kind of drew attention to the possibility that this ruin, this tragedy, this disaster, this failure might actually have a potential, not in spite of all the problems that it was facing, but because of them. This is an exhibition from 2003, so around the same time, by the artist Toby Patterson in Glasgow, who kind of particularly specialises and has a particular fascination with kind of mid-century modern architecture. And he produced images like this kind of painting of the building, in a sense, perfect, new, clean, and unencumbered by trees and burnt-out cars, but at the same time kind of curiously ruined as a kind of empty sculptural piece. But he also included references to the building in this exhibition, where paintings like the one we've just seen were displayed in the gallery with this fence running through the middle of the building. The fence is exactly the fence that is used to seal the building off from occupation, from unwelcome visitors. And so in a sense, these optimistic, sunny paintings of sparkling modern geometric buildings are set against the inevitability of their own ruination in the way that they're exhibited. And so this place is appreciated as a monument, as a ruin, as a meditation on the past and mortality and so on. But actually, something's happening all the time under everybody's noses that nobody's quite seeing. Because we've asked, how did this building become a ruin? Well, here's one answer. This building, and I don't know whether any of you as students in continuity in architecture are considering it as a site for a project, but it has been used as a site for a project by many, many students, certainly tens of students, if not hundreds of students, over the past few decades. Here's Martha Taylor from Cardiff, looking at it in 2012. Here's Eve Sudlow, around in 2014. Here's Gosha Brutikowska here in Edinburgh doing a project in 2012. So interesting, particularly all around the same time. And I think what's interesting about these, what is Martha's? It's a crematorium suspended within the ruins of the cemetery. What's Eve's? It's a future cemetery, a requiem for matter. And in a sense, the very ruination of the building lends itself to these kind of reflections on mortality, and the huge number of student projects in this site and this space that I've been able to uncover are all very much about this theme. Gosha's had a slightly different title, and I'm going to come to where it came from in a second. The idea that this building was somehow suspended. It was no longer what it was, it is not yet what it was going to be. And it was also impossible to visit. And so what she designed was a way of visiting the building without ever getting into it, instead following the metal fence around the outside of the building without ever touching its structure and looking into it from a distance. That title, No Longer and Not Yet, was initiated or taken initially by the artist Emma Cocker, who, instead of proposing an architectural solution, proposed a series of events to take place in the ruins, a series of debates, building on Tim Edensaw's idea that a ruin is a kind of debate. It's an incomplete building that is asking for completion, but not telling you how that should happen. Emma proposed to stage a series of debates about the future of the building within the building itself as a kind of temporary intervention. And of course, I've talked about it all so far as if it was a ruin with a fence around it that nobody could visit. But in actual fact, people were visiting it all the time. And there was a hole in the fence, and every time the church blocked up the hole in the fence, people broke in and would put things on the wall and would put all sorts of graffiti. There's some pretty hateful sectarian stuff, which I'm not going to show you. But you know, they go from the kind of the blindingly obvious on the right to the meditational quotation from Herbert Reed about modernism on the left. I've done a bit of kind of unpacking one wall of graffiti in the building. This is the wall next to the altar in the sanctuary, where I was particularly fascinated by the way that graffiti artists breaking into the building, probably on their own or with one or two friends, would speak to each other over time. So this was a kind of series of graffiti on the walls of the building that ended up in some particular senses telling its story. So the earliest piece of painting on the wall was this, a kind of fly as if landing on the floor, lying on a windowsill, being eaten by its own children, maggots that are around it, very much a kind of symbol of that relinquished, that ruined building. The next artist kind of painted it over, so you can just see the kind of weird kind of grassy things on the right, and painted it over with this one, the nun in the gas mask. This is a toxic environment. It's also an ecclesiastical environment, and there's a particularly interesting thing. You can see how the leg of the fly, for example, has become incorporated into this new graffiti, which is then subsumed in another one. Okay, so I think this is one of the Gallagher brothers, but if anyone can kind of correct me on this, I need to know. And soon enough, that becomes the devil, and soon enough, that becomes something straight out of Viz. And so this same wall has been overpainted again and again, probably by people who've never met one another, but in a sense are speaking to each other over time through the paintings on the wall. They're all over the place, these kind of extraordinary graffiti. And these are things that wouldn't, of course, have been painted if the building had been done up, looked after, cared about, and so on. Other people come there and make paintings of it and exhibit them elsewhere. The ruination is kind of Piranesi of 2015. And it's also led to other creative works. So this was a whole project looking at concrete casting and glass casting in their relation, using textile as a material to do that, as a kind of creative series of workshops inspired by the building. I love this one. Quite a lot of Glasgow School of Art students break into the building and use it as a sort of canvas and studio. This Lydia Levitt's It's Okay to Fail is great because that was her degree show. I think it's a great title for something in a degree show, and very brave to put it there in this space, which is, of course, a failed space by many lights. I became involved in the decade really from 2012 on, working and engaging in a number of workshops designed to, in a sense, rehearse or practice ways that the building could be reused in the future. We work with local heritage groups. On the left you can see the Strathleven Heritage Society, who are into reenactments of the battles of Robert the Bruce. We undertook kind of amateur or interventionist archaeology on the site, and we worked together to imagine ways, or tape out quite simply ways, that the site could be reoccupied and reused. And these events were organised by the arts organisation NVA in Glasgow, who, in a sense, they were really interested in this building, but they were event people. They weren't actually interested in building a building in architecture as such, but more in the kind of theatrics. So what happens when you ask the minister who's most interested in architecture in Scotland along and ask them to participate in these workshops? What happens when you get the planners in? What happens when you get the children who've broken into the building in to talk to the planners, and so on, as a way of engaging with the site? And their work culminated in 2016 with an event called Hinterland, which was a kind of one, at its cheapest, one would call it a kind of sonnet lumière on the site, which brought people there. It was a kind of mad, ridiculous idea. You've got this ruined, very dangerous, toxic concrete building, and you walk thousands of people through it in the middle of the night, and in a sense they explore it. So nobody, this building had become a bit of a legend behind its fence, locked away. People only break in there to buy and sell drugs and do graffiti or whatever it is, but then suddenly they're allowed to visit it, but only at night. They never see the complete building, the finished building. They only ever see its possibilities. In order to do this, a huge amount of work needed to be undertaken, in particular clearing the building of asbestos. And that involved, once the sun rose after these night events, a complete transformation of the site. On the left you can see it under construction or just completed in the 1960s. On the right you can see the building after Hinterland, where all those trees, all that shattered glass, all the pieces of timber has all been cleared away, and this building suddenly has the image not really of a ruin, unless it's a very kind of tidied up National Trust sort of ruin, but almost again something of a building site. And bit by bit, NVA found themselves drawn into making a more permanent proposal to fix the site, to reuse it as an arts venue. And conservation proposals were drawn up to look after the building, and so on. Landscape proposals to restore it as an arts venue. And then, in 2018, NVA, the arts organisation who had led this whole possibility of saving this building, said that they didn't want to do it. They handed the money back to the Heritage Lottery Fund and decided to step away from the project. Why? What they discovered in the process of going from being poacher to gamekeeper was that their responsibilities could no longer chime with their desire to play with this building as something incomplete, something full of possibility, something not finished. They were being asked to finish it, They were being asked to finish it in both senses of the word. If they finished with it, then this building would be finished. And so the building, they stepped away from the building in 2018, and that's where a new practice and a new scheme has moved in to look at this. And it's really interesting, the practice of doing this. It's Carmody Groke, who are well known for other kind of interventions in the kind of temporary sphere of buildings, and thinking about buildings as things happening over time. So their kind of encasing of the Hill House, Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House, as a kind of artifact in a very temporary shed, is about 5 miles away from Cardross, but also kind of very interesting kind of counterpart to it. So that's where we are with this building. And what I'd like us to imagine is that it's so easy to present this as a tragedy, so easy to present it as a disaster, so easy to present it as a series of failures. But if we look back at all those castles in the air, whether they are paintings or sculptures or events or possible buildings or designs for things or proposals, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them that could never and would never have been produced if the building had been saved and looked after. So I'd like to return to my mining town in India just to conclude by asking ourselves, like, what is it, or asking myself, what is it that I really enjoy about this? So on the left, we have the executive's mansion, which is now lived in by, I think, 8 different families who squatted and occupied the building. On the right-hand side, you can see the house of the mine owner, which is now buried under the detritus of the open cast mine. And we might say that both of those things are failures. Both of them are problems. But actually, I would like, looking at the picture on the left, to talk you through how some of those things that look like interruptions or failures or disasters are in fact acts of love. For example, the tarpaulin built out down the steps over the right-hand side of the portico is the outdoor kitchen, which enables the people who live in that part of the building to cook outside without smoking out the interior of the building, and it enables them to move in and out of the building and occupy it and live in it. The brushwood on the left-hand side of the image is there, has all been cut and picked out. It's very thorny, and it's there to keep the goats out from the vegetable patch, which is just behind it. The flag that's flying above the building is the sign that there's a temple there, and a shrine, a domestic shrine there, and so on. So these aren't signs of interference, they aren't signs of abandonment, they're signs of occupation. And the crater on the right-hand side isn't evidence of a failure, it's evidence of the tenacity of the villagers who have fought the mine tooth and nail to make sure that the remains of the house remain uncovered and visible in the middle of the rest of their devastated landscape. And so when you're presented with ruins, when you're presented with failures, when you're presented with disasters, I think sometimes it's worth asking yourself, is it a problem? Does it need fixing? Or, in a sense, what is actually productive about these kind of situations? What do they produce? They may not, perhaps the problem in the building on the left isn't the tarpaulin or the fence or the trees, it's the classical architecture itself that should be allowed to crumble away, and we concentrate on preserving the awning. Perhaps in the end, on the right, it's the crater, which is the monument, rather than the building it surrounds. So I'll finish up there, but hopefully that was a kind of a provocation, perhaps, to think about when we address and encounter buildings of this nature, then what do they produce beyond our own intentions for them? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. think it strikes me that you talked a number of times about storytelling and throughout your work, and this is a story which is tragic and comic, about idealism, about romanticism. There's aspects of creative inspiration throughout, and I guess I wanted to ask a question arising from that, which is that we are, as architects, if we're invited to write, it's a bit of a cliche, but write the next chapter of a building, where does that come from? What kind of writing, as it were, are we doing when we tackle a building? Are we writing a textbook or a biography or a piece of fiction?
Yeah, I think we're always writing fiction. We're always writing about futures that haven't happened yet, and nobody knows whether they will. I mean, I think it's terrifying when you imagine that, all buildings which are built this year were prophesied 10 years ago, probably. I mean, in the sense that buildings take a long time to build and make, and so they are fictions at the time that they're posited. I think in terms of there's something maybe in something like a recipe. I know that, I mean, it might not sound like it's the highest form of literature, but actually it's a really interesting one because a recipe allows me to make a different spaghetti bolognese to you, and yet somehow they're both recognizably spaghetti bolognese. And in the same way, when we are talking about the kind of occupation, or in a sense, if architecture is a means to the occupation of space, which is not the only way of interpreting it, I will admit, but it's that actually, in a sense, we know that we can't dictate how people are going to occupy what we do. We know that we can't do that. We know it always goes wrong. So how can we write in such a way that's suggestive or provocative, that kind of might kind of shape things rather than dictate them? And I think one of the real problems we had with the Card Ross project actually was endlessly people going, so what's it going to be like when it's finished? What are people going to do? And actually the kind of real aspiration was not to know, to go, well, in 20 years time we'll all be retired and dead and old, so of course we won't know what's going to happen to the building.
And that's very interesting, because it strikes me, it goes back to the very first slide you showed of the origins of your interest in architecture. The idea that somehow there is something finished, and then there is something that is, as it were, perfect, the architect's dream, and then endlessly preserved. So alongside this question of mortality, which hangs over us, all of us, and every streak on our building is evidence of a slide into decay. There is also this idea of immortality, and it really comes across very powerfully in talking about Card Ross, that there is a route to immortality, but it's not the route that we thought of when we dreamt of being architects. The answer is to get your building an award and then get it listed.
Well, that's kind of zombie immortality, or kind of the body of the people. It's like kind of the embalmed. But in a sense, I think there's fascinating immortalities in buildings which go beyond their own particular material thing. I mean, I'm sure that most people here will be aware of the kind of the immortality of the Ise Shrine in Japan, which is simultaneously 20 years old and 2,000 years old at the same time.
Yeah.
Or I mean, the first story I kind of sat down to seriously write, and again was really provoked by Mary Beard's fantastic book about it, is the Parthenon, which is definitively a ruin, and definitively the thing that everyone goes, oh, that's what architecture is meant to be. And you think, does that mean it's meant to be a ruin? No, it means that there's just endless copies of it, and it's such a repeated kind of trope that actually you could get rid of every part of the original Parthenon and that would be irrelevant.
So what do you think people see when they see the Parthenon, Ed? What do you think they're because Chris Woodward talks about the, in his book In Ruins, he talks about when we contemplate the ruin, we contemplate our own mortality. But is that really what people do when they look at that, or indeed look at Card Ross? What's going on?
It depends on how you're coming at it. So I think, for example, Card Ross had these really different constituencies of visitors. So there are always lots of very kind of people making architectural pilgrimages to go there
Yeah.
and kind of sorrow over its state. But remember that probably the larger majority of visitors were teenagers going there to set light to doors and have barbecues on them. And to them, the ruin was an opportunity. I mean, I'm sure as all of us as teenagers have loved that whole thing of you go into an abandoned building and play around. It's been one of the kind of intoxicating things about the last 2 years is kind of all these empty spaces, these abandoned spaces, is kind of there's something curiously, well, the whole urbex movement it becomes about that kind of the excitement of those sorts of things. So I think it can be both, and I think it there's that sense of kind of that they can be fertile, I guess, is what I'm trying to communicate, is that a ruin is fertile. It's fertile to the imagination. I mean, John Summerson writes this lovely essay about, and he's really kind of advising the National Trust and English Heritage in 1950 or something. They're going, how much should we ruin ruins? Corfe Castle or something. And he's going, well, you know, if you ruin them too much, then nobody can imagine what was there. But if you don't ruin them enough, then there's not enough left to the imagination. It's kind of so there's and it's about getting exactly the right balance of crinkliness in the wall, so that you can kind of tell it was a wall, but you can tell it isn't a wall anymore.
Which was Ruskin's great contribution to the idea over and against what, say, Viollet-le-Duc was doing, and in terms of perfecting ruins into something, an imagining of what they might have been.
Yeah, and there's a great set of writings, weirdly, in landscape gardening in the 18th century, where they go about how to construct your perfect Gothic tower in your back garden. And they give you very specific advice about how big the cracks should be in the wall and how the ivy should come up it and all this kind of thing, so that everyone's taken in.
There's one other question which from me is prompted by what you said, and certainly by what you quoted from Gordon Benson, which is the question of leaving it as an archaeological monument. And you must have thought of this. What is it? If it was an architectural monument, what is it a monument to, you think?
Very good question. And I think actually the two preceding quotes, and there's whole schools of thought come out of this. So that, there are loads of people who see it as a parable about the failure of modernism.
Yeah.
There are just as many people in the 2016, 17, 18, amid all the child abuse scandals, who see it as a monument to the failure of the Roman Catholic Church. And it's curious because both of those things don't necessarily align as points of view, but it's
and there must be a story, an equivalent story about the Parthenon somewhere along the way, and Greek culture.
Countless. It was a wicked church to the Ottomans. It was a mosque. It was kind of all these other things. And I mean, I think what's fascinating, isn't it, when you think about real archaeological monuments, is that nobody has the slightest idea what they were for. I mean, the fascination of Stonehenge and Avebury and all that kind of things, you go, yeah, I get it's cosmic, but like you've got no idea. None of us have any idea, kind of. And actually that lends to a wonderful kind of fabulation, because it means that actually we all get to construct our own Stonehenge. And actually I wonder whether a modernist building like this, a very programmatic modernist building, left long enough, it would be great to see what people thought it was in 500 years' time, when kind of nobody's ever heard of modernism or Roman Catholicism or something.
But doesn't that come back to your idea of stories again? The idea that we I mean, some of those stories are malign, but actually the story, we start to inhabit Stonehenge. We have the empathy with the people who lived, how heavy those stones must have been, but we also write in our mind's eye what those stories are. And I guess as architects, and when we're coming to not Stonehenge, but another existing building, what we're doing is it's a kind of act of empathy across the ages, isn't it? That we're attempting to, at least in part, to and also if we're doing it in a manner which is sympathetic, which works with what we've found and uncovered.
Mm-hmm. Well, I find that particular thing about empathy is something that I've really particularly encountered in kind of interior ruins and domestic interior ruins. I mean, the other aspect of what I do is write a lot about period rooms, for example, which are ruins of a different sort. The kind of remains of somebody's domestic life in very intimate things like, you know, pillow covers or jars on tables and all that kind of thing. I think, yeah, really kind of there are things that spark that particular, you know, set of empathies. I mean, there's in the Parthenon, for example, there's some amazing, very, very personal pieces of graffiti from 2,500 years ago. You know, kind of tiny marks that you're almost invisible that are kind of put there as very intimate gestures and encounters with the building.
Yeah, that's what I love about the work of Chipperfield and Julian Harrop at the Noise Museum in Berlin. The dignity that's given, I think, is probably the word to the most minor of historic interventions and accidents, because that word again, they tell a story, which I think is very powerful. I'll come back maybe with a couple of other questions, and there certainly is a couple of staff questions for you, Ed, but I want to hand over now to Colin, who's been gathering a couple of questions on behalf of the MSSA and the student body. Colin, do you want to jump in with some points?
Sure. So thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting. I had some other questions, but after you talked to John, I kind of had another one. I think it kind of links to what you were talking. So if a ruined building is like, let's say, a canvas for imagination, how do you know when to intervene and try to quote unquote save it, and when do you let it be?
Yeah, and I could have no single rule about such a thing, but I think this is where the art of storytelling might be really, really useful as a model or a way of thinking about it. Because if you think about some people, you could have the same script, you could have the same story, all of us could tell Little Red Riding Hood, and we would all tell it in slightly differently, and some of us would make it amazing and some of us would make it boring. And what is that kind of suggestiveness or that kind of slight turn of phrase that can actually get something to work? And I think that kind of tuning is what's so important when dealing with ruins, is actually or existing buildings, is that kind of spending time with them. The people who've managed to make it really work are people who've got to know somewhere really, 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 really well. I mean, you know, not many of us in our lives are going to have the luxury of Carlo Scarpa spending 20 years at the Castel Vecchio or whatever. You know, very few projects are constructed like that, but I think some of those that are, that allows one to do it. I think it's being aware of, and this is a lesson I learned when I was working for Richard Murphy doing the kind of alterations of existing buildings, is that there was always a bit of a problem of going, you go, okay, I'm doing my alteration to the existing building, but how's somebody going to alter my alteration? And how do you still leave things open? I think we have a terrible disease as architects sometimes, that we want to design everything. Yeah. And actually we really, really, really shouldn't. Other people do ashtrays better, you know, but like, other people do door handles better probably. But actually just leaving things like, just leave it, let a wall be blank. Let nothing let a room be square. So not, I mean, you know, and so that there's possibilities for other people to actually make their interventions into spaces. And that then we'll get paranoid because we'll go, oh God, I'm doing nothing, I'm not doing enough. But actually, you know, I think that's sometimes incredibly important too, and it's knowing when to hold back and go, right, I'm going. My favourite story is a very simple one. You all know it. And they laid him in a manger because there was no room at the inn. And that story, very, you know, one sentence, and they laid him in a manger because there was no room at the inn, has unleashed 1 billion cribs over 2,000 years, 1 billion mangers and little children dressed up as, you know, the baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary, of 5 million different versions, because it's suggestive, because it tells you nothing. The sentence says has so little in it.
Yeah.
We all get to do something with it, I think.
Okay, so just building on this, could you please highlight some key aspects, very important for you, that we should consider as students? For example, when we want to, let's say, future-proof our design? So if it ends up abandoned, how can we design in such a way that people will be able to repurpose it later?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question, and it's something which the Cardross project was a great lesson in, I think, but they had a very keen sense of it, and I think there are some other architects like Kahn has done this really well as well. People of that period, a really strong sense of the temporality of different parts of your building, that there are going to be things which will still be there in 200 years' time, and there are loads of things which you really care about, but they'll only be there for 10 years. And actually being really aware of that kind of thing, that nobody's going to replace your bit like for like in 25 years time. They just won't. They'll just do something else. And actually, so people talk about the skeleton of a building or whatever it is. So I think that's
it's a question. That's a question about design life, really, isn't it, Ed? So there's it's boring kind of quantity surveyors sort of description, but actually when you consider it architecturally, it's invested with great significance. It's the idea that there are persistent parts of the building, and one of the master strokes of Cardross is that everything structure, well, everything but the wooden clad glazing, and so you have a building which can, wind and rain cannot kill it. It fundamentally exists as a structural form of great potency. Because of the way it's conceived.
I mean, somebody's mentioned reversibility here as well, and I think that's a really interesting concept when we come to talk about historic buildings.
Yeah. So the question, I'll just read out the question: does this mean reversibility should ideally be a key consideration when designing in historic settings? It's a big thing with the listed building, the conservation officer, isn't it? That's what they want to see. Oh, and I see Dan's popped up there. I ought to have, out of courtesy, I should have mentioned that Dan is now on our staff. So
hello, Ed.
Hi.
Been a while.
Yeah.
And I know Dan's got something to say about reversibility, I think.
Well, just just a little snapshot of the history. But in 2002, when Penny and I, those photographs were taken, just a little thing about that, those photographs were taken at dusk at the shortest day of the year, quite specifically to kind of capture that moment of a kind of last gasp. And in 2002 in December, and it was because the diocese had appointed a developer, and the developer was putting in a planning application on their behalf, on their own behalf, if you like, in order to raise £28 million by building these houses to preserve Cardross as a ruin. And I'm not a structural engineer. I took one look at what they were doing, which included removing the roof. And I knew immediately what they were doing was ensure that it would fall down as they preserved it as a ruin. So they deliberately worked out which bits of structures to remove in order for it to collapse. So I funded some engineers, started the Preservation Trust with Penny and John Deffenbaugh, and funded some engineers to write a report to demonstrate that they were intentionally demolishing a grade A listed building, not to preserve it to a ruin at all. So that just relates really well to your point, John, that although some people may have made some statements about an archaeological ruin, they picked up on that and said, we'll have the ruin in the park, but they were actually using it as a vehicle to get it out of the way at that point. And that was the point that generated all of this kind of activism around keeping it. I just thought I'd throw that in there. But it is your point. When everything's tied to something else, it's both remarkable, but it's also, it makes it less resilient. A bit like a circle, and you remove one part of it, then the whole circle collapses,
And it's surprisingly fragile, actually. I mean, there's things like the wall at the back around the altar, which looks like this massive concrete thing. And actually, it turns out it's being held in place by timber beams, which are no longer there. So it's now kind of falling into the valley behind it,
Yeah, I know Jose has a question as well, which we come back to in a second. But since since Dan was on the floor previously, I think you've got a question you wanted to come in
Well,
with.
just on the reversibility thing someone's thrown in there. No, I think buildings in terms of sustainability need to be reversible, you know, and this particular approach to structure made it quite unadaptable, and it's been part of the challenges for it. So that's something for designers to consider in the future. I mean, I want to compliment you because so many people have told their story of Cardross in so many, or St. Peter's Seminary in so many ways. But the central tenet of your thesis is fantastic. And I think maybe just returning to it, as I understood it, which is that it has all these futures, which is why we tried to keep it. You know, your essay there captured everything we were trying to articulate and thinking about back in 2002-3. It's like, it needs to survive, but only if it can be reused. It needs an ongoing future in a state tension. It's really special as it is. It's, you know, and I was fighting David Page, who wanted to restore it. And I was like, it's absolutely no point. There's no one who needs it for what it was. So you need to find a new future for it. And I just think that your thesis, if you could return to it and reflect to it as part of the closing, I think, which is just about, that as much it's about the futures in people's minds, and it's about the ongoing imagination with it. And I think you made a really good point about why NVA walked away. I've not heard that expressed so clearly, you know, but I also have that sense from my conversations with them that it couldn't keep it alive and in a state of change. And that whole thing about fixing it, I just thought maybe just pull that together again for everyone, because I think that was the real heart of what you were saying.
So I suppose the ruins, it comes, there's enough of it there to provoke ideas and get people to create things around it. If it disappeared, obviously that wouldn't happen, but there would be this legacy of the million phantom Cardrosses which exist out there. But yeah, absolutely completing the building would lock all that down. There would be nothing to do. You know, and I think that was the kind of real feeling about it, is that actually, you know, what's always fascinating about a ruin is the irritation. You know, it's the dripping ceiling, and you go, well, the dripping ceiling makes you fix it. Whereas if there's a perfect ceiling, nobody does anything. It's like people with electric doors. You know, people get used to electric doors opening for them all the time, and they forget how to put out their bleeding arm and open it. And it's kind of, and you know, and actually, you know, how can buildings make us active citizens in things as opposed to kind of passive spectators in how gorgeous they are? You know, it's like, how do they make us make things?
Curlin, I hear that you've got a couple more questions lined up. Is that correct? Do you want to ping some over from students?
So I just wanted to actually invite Jose to ask his question.
Go on. Okay, yeah.
Okay, here I am. Thank you, Ed. I really enjoyed the presentation. So my question is just out of curiosity. You know, it's just, what's your take, what's your opinion on these two drawings? On one hand, this project by Schinkel in the Parthenon. I know you talk about the Parthenon in the Secret Lives of Buildings, but somehow this one, the way he deals with the ruins, giving new life to that area and so on. The other one is Johnson's drawing his own project for the Bank of England in ruins. Mm-hmm. So just from the beginning, anticipating this future that will be a ruin. I would like you to elaborate that a bit more.
Sure, yeah. So both of those are such fantastic and very kind of ambiguous examples, aren't they? So I think in terms of Schinkel's plan for the Royal Palace, anyone who doesn't know it, it was a kind of, you know, Greece has been liberated or invented, and kind of they build this palace for the Bavarian royal family to go and be the kings of Greece, and he invents this kind of plinth. So the palace is an almost invisible plinth of courtyards and kind of very internal spaces, and then this kind of the ruin of the Parthenon is in the middle of it, and I often wonder whether it's a kind of deliberate. I don't know the history of it in detail, but if you imagine that the Leo von Klenzer's plan for the Acropolis and for Athens is to denude it completely. So, you know, while they're drawing these drawings, there is actually a village of real people living on the Acropolis, but they're all wicked Ottoman Turks who need to be cleansed away because they're on the wrong side of the thing, and so it becomes this kind of interesting kind of game about what to do with it. There's a fascinating story that during the War of Independence for Greece, the Acropolis was under siege, and the Turks were in the Acropolis. The Greek army is down below, and the Turks are firing on them, and then they run out of bullets. And the Greek army look up and they can see that the Turks are chipping away at the Parthenon to get at the iron cramps in the building to melt them down to turn into bullets. And they're so horrified that the Greeks send the Turkish army more bullets so that they don't damage the Parthenon. And because it acquires in the Greek War of Independence this kind of particular iconic kind of nature. But I think, yeah, what's fascinating about, and I suppose so in Schinkel's Palace, this ruin somehow acquires the quality of a kind of prophecy, or it's definitely the statement, isn't it, that Greece is back, Greece is restored, and what Greece really is kind of the Athens of Pericles, you know, that's kind of returned there. I think in the context of Soane's Bank of England, yeah, it's a really it's a very tricky drawing, isn't it? Because it's kind of like one of those axos that's designed to reveal the workings of the building. So that's kind of job one. But then it's done constructed as this ruin. Is that because it's saying, well, you know, we are Britain is the Rome of the early 19th century, and you know
that's exactly its ambiguity, isn't it, Ed? Because it's both celebrating a building that's lasted 1,000 years, but also depicting its ultimate failure, its demise. So it has that incredible ambiguity, which is very powerful, isn't it?
I wonder if we often, you know, all buildings are in transformation all of the time, and you know, that actually, if we think of the building site and the ruin as the mirror of one another, and the kind of that there are all sorts of things which are kind of really similar about them. Both of them are surrounded by millions of anxieties regarding health and safety, for example, and access, and incompleteness and time. You know, because you know, oh, will it be finished or will it fall? And actually, it'd be quite interesting if, you know, you imagine doing the time lapse film of the fall of ancient Rome, and would it look like the building of ancient Rome? I don't know. But that actually the processes of construction and the processes of deconstruction are kind of mirrors. And I think, you know, in Cardross, for example, one of the great lessons that I learned was that it's not just the weather. I mean, the weather in Glasgow is pretty bad, but it's people. It's people going in there. It's smashing the windows. It's burning the doors, taking things away. You know, that actually makes that happen. And it's like kind of Gibbon says about the fall of ancient Rome. It's like because they built it into something else. You know, it's that ruination isn't a passive thing. It's actually a kind of, it's kind of like Dan was saying, actually, that you do things and it causes it to happen. I think the last thing I'd say about Soane and Schinkel is they are in the golden age of the folly. And they're in a world where people walk around and look at hermits living in cottages and kind of fake ruined castles. And they kind of, what I love about that world is they somehow believe it and don't believe it at the same time. You know, they're going, it is a ruin, it's not a ruin. They know perfectly well the hermit isn't a hermit. They know perfectly well the ruin isn't a ruin. But it's kind of that suspension of disbelief.
Well, I think, isn't it also in the Romantic movement, it's also about the indulgence of an emotion. It's when cast, you see it out of the corner of your eye and it could be a ruin. And your heart is kind of reaches towards it, as it were. So to me, it always feels as though it's on that kind of level. Sorry to cut things short because it's a really interesting conversation, but we are nearly at the end of time. I think, Colin, do you want to ask your question, or are you the one of me?
Actually, there's one final question for you, John. So as part of CIA, I was wondering, what will you take away from Ed's talk to help in your tutorials or your students?
Yeah. Well, it was a great talk. I haven't said that properly, Ed, but thank you very much for it. It was it was really stimulating, and especially for the stage that we're at in teaching. We're now embarking on, at least in the year 5 group, we're embarking on looking at existing buildings and how they might be adapted and reused. And it's a really timely reminder, therefore, that the clock never stops. I suppose there was always forward motion. Entropy is the ghost that hangs over every building and structure, and that the idea of something being finished is an artifice. It's an invention. It's something which is a psychological comfort to us, but not much more than that. And I think I would say, in terms of tutorials, I would say that the depiction of that contingency, that contingent state, I think, is something that we need to be practiced in when we're dealing with existing buildings. We often polish them, and even the Cardross images produced by Avanti looked looked too polished, didn't they? So I think I'd want to give that sort of critical reflection to some of the student work, I'm sure. But very, very good, very helpful.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, at this point, it remains for me to say thanks very much to Professor Ed Hollis for kicking off this calendar year's lecture. Fascinating, stimulating, and actually incredibly inspiring, because storytelling is something that we forget in the process of churning out designs for a degree. Tell the story and tell it beautifully. Over to Jonathan.
Yeah, just to reiterate, thanks so much, Ed, for just an amazing, I think it was a biography of an abandoned building, as you put it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now, just before we depart, I'd just like to share my screen quickly with everybody and invite Dan back to just explain the event that will be happening as part of MSA Thursdays next week.
So guys, this has been carefully scheduled, so it's directly after the CIA Atelier Night, because this really feeds into CIA Atelier as well. It's all about narratives and can you remake your city? Can people remake their city through narrative? What is the role of storytelling in city making? We've got absolutely amazing speakers. So Morag is a psychogeographer teaching at Liverpool University, and she does walks once a month for the last 20 years through Manchester, and we're talking about rivers in particular. David Lynch is a filmmaker, not the better known one. He just won this year's best climate action film with the film he's just made, and his work is all about storytelling too. I'm going to ask you, Jonathan, to put a couple of links in for those two when you do the announcement tomorrow. And just to let everybody know that the MSA Thursdays will break its rule slightly next week, and there'll be a run on for 10 or 15 minutes when we launch a student competition, a film competition to make a film, and Dave Lynch will be the judge of that competition. So he's going to do a little Q&A. You'll probably see something about that online next week. But those who come to the MSA Thursday, if you're here in person, we might actually do it outside Benzie, but there'll be a little bit of an announcement and a Q&A next Thursday. Okay, thanks everybody.
Great. Thanks everyone. Thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you at the next event. And thank you once again to Ed Hollis for such an amazing talk. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much.
So you told you you'd get 2 rounds of applause. Bye everyone. See you next time.